In the summer of 1587, more than 100 English men, women, and children stepped onto the shores of a strange and distant island. They had crossed the Atlantic Ocean in small wooden ships, leaving behind everything they knew. England was now thousands of miles away. Ahead of them stood thick forests, unfamiliar waters, and a land that seemed to stretch endlessly beyond the horizon. They called the place Roanoke. To the settlers, it was supposed to be the beginning of something new, a permanent English colony in the New World, a place where families could build homes, grow crops, raise children, and create a future far from the crowded streets and religious conflicts of Europe. Instead, Roanoke became one of history's greatest mysteries, because 3 years later, when help finally arrived, every single person was gone. There were no bodies, no signs of a battle, no graves, only abandoned buildings, an empty settlement, and one strange word carved into a wooden post: Croatoan. The story of Roanoke did not begin with a disappearance. It began with ambition. During the late 16th century, England was eager to compete with Spain, which had already established powerful colonies across the Americas. Queen Elizabeth I wanted England to claim territory of its own, and explorers promised that the New World was filled with opportunities. One of the men behind this dream was Sir Walter Raleigh. He never personally traveled to Roanoke, but he organized and financed expeditions to the region. Raleigh imagined a successful colony that could provide resources, strengthen England's position in the Atlantic, and perhaps serve as a base for attacks against Spanish ships. The first attempt to settle Roanoke began in 1585. It did not go well. The first settlers were mostly soldiers and explorers rather than farmers and families. Food became scarce. Relations with the local indigenous communities became tense. At one point, the English settlers accused a nearby village of stealing a silver cup. In response, they burned the village and destroyed its crops. It was a violent and reckless act. The settlers soon realized they could not survive without outside support. When the English privateer Sir Francis Drake passed through the area in 1586, most of them abandoned the colony and returned to England. But the failure did not end the dream. A second group was organized the following year. This time the colony would be different. It would include families, craftsmen, women, and children. The goal was not merely to explore or build a military outpost. The goal was to create a real community. The settlers were led by a man named John White. White was an artist, mapmaker, and explorer. He had visited the region before and had created detailed drawings of its people, animals, and landscapes. Now he had been chosen to serve as governor of the new colony. For White, the journey was more than a political mission. His own family was traveling with him. His daughter, Eleanor Dare, was one of the settlers. She was pregnant when the group arrived at Roanoke. Her husband, Ananias Dare, was also part of the colony. Not long after their arrival, Eleanor gave birth to a baby girl. They named her Virginia Dare. She became the first English child born in the Americas. For the colonists, her birth must have felt like a symbol of hope. In a place filled with uncertainty, a new life had begun. Perhaps the colony truly could survive. Perhaps Roanoke could become a home. But almost immediately, serious problems appeared. The settlers had not originally planned to remain on Roanoke Island. Their intended destination was farther north, near the Chesapeake Bay, where the land was believed to be more suitable for farming. However, the ship's pilot refused to take them farther. The colonists were left at Roanoke, the site of the previous failed settlement. When they arrived, they found the remains of the old fort, damaged and overgrown. One of the Englishmen who had stayed behind after the first colony had apparently been killed. The surrounding communities had not forgotten the earlier violence. The new settlers were beginning their lives in a place already shaped by fear, anger, and mistrust. They tried to repair the old buildings and plant food, but their supplies were limited. The season was already late. They needed help from England if they were going to survive. After several weeks, the colonists made a difficult decision. John White would return to England. He would gather food, equipment, and additional settlers, then sail back to Roanoke as quickly as possible. White did not want to leave. His daughter, son-in-law, and newborn granddaughter were all staying behind. The Atlantic crossing was dangerous, and there was no guarantee he would return safely. But the colony needed supplies. Before leaving, White and the settlers agreed on a system of communication. If the colony had to move, they would carve the name of their new location into a tree or wooden post. If they were forced to leave because of danger, they would also carve a cross above the word. It was a simple plan. At the time, no one imagined that this sign would become the only clue left behind. White sailed for England in late 1587. He expected to return within a few months. But history had other plans. England was preparing for war with Spain. King Philip II had assembled a massive naval force known as the Spanish Armada. Queen Elizabeth ordered many ships to remain in England for national defense. John White struggled to find a vessel willing to carry him back across the Atlantic. He begged shipowners, merchants, and officials for help. He eventually managed to leave England with 2 small ships, but they were attacked by French privateers. The expedition was forced to turn back. White was trapped in England, while his family and the other colonists waited thousands of miles away. Months passed, then a year, then another. No one knows exactly what happened on Roanoke Island during that time. Perhaps the settlers continued to repair their houses and plant crops. Perhaps they watched the ocean each morning, hoping to see English sails on the horizon. Maybe Eleanor Dare held her daughter in her arms and told her that her grandfather would return soon. Maybe the colonists counted their remaining barrels of grain and wondered how long the food would last. They may have heard movement in the forests at night. They may have argued over whether to stay or leave. They may have grown angry with John White, believing he had abandoned them. Or perhaps they understood. Perhaps they knew that if he could return, he would. White finally reached Roanoke in August 1590. It was Virginia Dare's 3rd birthday. The journey back had taken almost 3 years. As the rescue party approached the island, they saw smoke in the distance. For a brief moment, White may have believed the settlers were still alive. The smoke could have come from their cooking fires. But when the sailors landed, they found no one waiting for them. The settlement was silent. The houses had been taken apart rather than destroyed. There were no bodies lying in the open. No weapons were scattered across the ground. There was no obvious evidence that the colonists had been attacked. On one tree, the searchers found the letters CRO carved into the bark. Then they found the full word carved into a wooden post, Croatoan. There was no cross above it. According to the agreement White had made with the colonists, the absence of a cross meant they had not left under immediate threat. Croatoan was not a meaningless word. It was the name of a nearby island, now known as Hatteras Island. It was also the name of the indigenous people who lived there. The Croatoan people had generally been friendlier toward the English than some of the other local communities. To John White, the message seemed clear. The settlers must have moved to Croatoan Island. Perhaps they had run out of food and gone there for help. Perhaps they had joined the local community. Perhaps they were alive, waiting to be found. White wanted to sail to Croatoan immediately, but the weather turned against him. A storm approached, and the ship's anchors were lost. The sailors refused to remain near the dangerous coastline. They were already short on supplies and feared their ships would be destroyed. White pleaded with them. His family might be only a short distance away. His daughter might still be alive. His granddaughter, Virginia, might be there. But the captain decided to leave. John White never returned to Roanoke. He never discovered what happened to his family. For centuries, historians, archaeologists, and amateur investigators have tried to solve the mystery. One theory is that the colonists were killed. They may have been attacked by a hostile indigenous group or by Spanish soldiers searching for English settlements. Several years after the disappearance, reports suggested that some colonists had been massacred, but these stories were inconsistent and often based on rumors. There was no clear battlefield at Roanoke. No mass grave was discovered. No physical evidence proved that all the settlers had died violently. Another theory is that they attempted to sail back to England by themselves. The colonists had access to a small boat, and desperation may have pushed them to take the risk. But crossing the Atlantic in such a vessel would have been nearly impossible. If they tried, they may have disappeared into the ocean without leaving a trace. Some people believe the colonists moved inland. Archaeological discoveries have revealed European objects in areas far from Roanoke Island. Pieces of pottery, tools, and weapons have been found at sites connected to indigenous communities. However, European items could have arrived through trade. A single object does not prove that the Roanoke settlers lived there. The most believable explanation remains the one hidden in the carved message: Croatoan. The colonists may have divided into smaller groups. Some could have traveled into Croatoan Island, while others moved inland in search of food and safety. Over time, they may have joined indigenous communities. If this happened, they did not simply vanish. They adapted. They learned new ways to survive. They may have married into local families, raised children, and gradually become part of another society. There were later stories of indigenous people in the region with lighter eyes, European features, or knowledge of English customs. But these accounts were written long after the colony disappeared and cannot be confirmed. The truth may be less dramatic than the legend. There may have been no sudden massacre, no secret curse, and no supernatural disappearance. Perhaps the colonists left because they were hungry. Perhaps they understood that England was not coming back soon. Perhaps the word Croatoan was not a mysterious final warning. Perhaps it was simply an address, a message saying, "We went there." And yet, even this explanation leaves painful questions. If the colonists survived on Croatoan Island, why were they never found? Why did no one return to the settlement? Why was there no second message? And what happened to Virginia Dare? She would have been around 3 years old when John White returned. If she survived, she may have grown up speaking a different language and living a life completely unlike the one her parents had imagined for her. She may have forgotten England, a country she had never seen. She may have become part of a community that history later ignored. Or she may have died during those difficult years, one of many children lost to hunger, disease, or conflict. We will probably never know. Roanoke has remained famous because it represents one of humanity's deepest fears, the fear of disappearing without being understood. The colonists left behind no diaries explaining their final days. No survivor returned to tell the story. There is no ending written in their own words. Instead, there is silence, an empty settlement, a grandfather who arrived too late, and a single word carved into wood. For John White, that word may have been hope. It told him that his family had moved somewhere else and might still be alive. For later generations, it became something darker, a clue with no answer, a doorway that leads nowhere. More than 400 years later, people still travel to the coast of North Carolina and imagine what the island must have looked like in 1590. They picture John White walking between the abandoned houses. They imagine him calling the names of his daughter and granddaughter. They imagine the wind moving through the trees while no one answers. Somewhere beyond the shore lay Croatoan Island. Maybe the answer was waiting there. Maybe it still is. But the ships sailed away. The settlement disappeared beneath the forests, and the people of Roanoke passed into legend. All that remained was their final message: Croatoan.